Horse found a wounded Apache woman and alerted his owner. It changed everything. The wind coming off the ridge was a cruel, sharp thing, a blade of cold that sliced through Wyatt Stone's coat as he stood leaning against the corral gate. Late autumn had painted the far pasture a brittle, desolate gray, and the scent of snow hung heavy in the air, a promise of harsher days to come. He held a tin grain bucket in one hand, shaking it twice the familiar rattle, a ghost of the life he used to know. Most mornings, Shadow came trotting toward him with easy grace, his bay gelding's ears pricked for feed. But today, the horse lingered out near the creek, circling, snorting, throwing his head like some wild, untamable thing. Wyatt frowned, a hard line etched on his weathered face. Shadow wasn't the kind of horse to act up for no reason. He latched the corral gate behind him and walked out across the pasture, his boots crunching through the frozen grass, his breath fogging in the bitter cold. The familiar, tight pull in his left side, a souvenir from a forgotten war, a constant echo of pain, made itself known with every step. The sky pressed low, color of hammered pewter, the kind that meant a squall might roll off the ridge with no warning and bury everything in a fit of white. He'd lived alone 5 years now, ever since Sarah had been taken from him by the sickness that swept through the valley. Folks had called it a fever one week and a mercy the next, because it took quick and didn't linger, but Wyatt knew there was nothing merciful about losing a life that way. The house had fallen quiet in a single night, and the quiet had never really left. It had moved into the walls, into the floorboards, into the space behind his ribs. He didn't talk about her, not to the men he bartered with in Dusty Creek, not to the circuit preacher who came twice a year and pretended to remember everyone's name, and certainly not to himself. The ranch became a silent, empty tomb, save for Shadow and the wind, and Wyatt liked it that way. The unending work kept his hands busy and, if he was lucky, his mind numb. Fix a rail, mend a strap, patch a roof shingle, cut the winter wood, repeat until the dark came down and washed his thoughts blank. That had been the small, blunt liturgy of his days. But now, Shadow had stopped near the cut bank, his ears pinned forward, pawing the ground with a frantic energy that didn't fit the rhythm of the morning. Wyatt's heart, a thing he thought had long since turned to stone, gave a sharp, painful jolt before he even saw her. At first he thought it was a heap of old hides or a torn bedroll thrown from some drifter's pack. Then the shape shifted, just barely, and the sense of it, a human form, collapsed, and wrong hit him with the force of a hammer. He took the last few yards at a trot. She was lying face down in the frozen grass, one arm curled under her, her knees scraped raw. The deerskin tunic she wore was torn at the shoulder and caked with dirt. The leather laces were frayed and hanging loose, so that the neckline had fallen open across her chest. Blood had soaked into the fabric there, not fresh, but a dark, sticky testament to her ordeal. Her hair, a long, thick braid of midnight black, was full of burrs and stuck to her face. She was clutching a length of a leather strap in one hand, as if it had been a shackle recently torn away. Wyatt crouched, his movements slow and deliberate, and touched 2 fingers to the side of her neck. There it was, a pulse, faint and stuttering, but present, a stubborn refusal to let go. Her lips were cracked, her knuckles were scraped, as if she'd fought something larger than herself and won the privilege of collapse. The air was so cold that the edges of her breath frosted near her mouth. He spoke her no words at first. Words felt like a foolish currency here, out in the open, with the sky hanging heavy and the earth holding its breath. She stirred when his shadow fell across her, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping half-second, her eyes opened. They were dark, wide, and wild, like a trapped bird's, full of a fear that went deeper than pain, down into the marrow where memory lives. Then they closed again, her breathing a shallow, quick gasp. Wyatt sat back on his heels, the cold seeping into his bones as he stared down at her. He knew the choices as well as he knew the back of his hand. He could leave her here and ride for town, but by the time he came back, she'd be a frozen corpse. He could try to move her to the barn, but the air was already dropping with the sun, and if she died out here, he'd be the one who had let it happen. Shadow snorted and took 2 nervous steps back, as if to make room for the moment to decide itself. Wyatt cursed under his breath, the sound a low, rough growl that turned into a white cloud and drifted away. He slid one arm under her knees, the other behind her back, surprised by the weight of her, which was less than he expected, as if hardship had chiseled her down to the necessary parts. She smelled of sweat, dried blood, smoke, and the metallic tang of terror so profound it made his own chest ache. When he lifted, the old wound in his left side pulled like a hooked fish, but he stood anyway. The long, lonely walk back to the cabin stretched ahead, each step a small vow not to fail again. Shadow trailed quietly behind, a silent witness. The cabin, which had always felt vast and empty, contracted around them as soon as he shouldered the door open. He laid her gently on the bed, shoved the door shut against the howling wind, and built the fire until the stovetop glowed a dangerous, angry red. Heat pushed the cold back from the room's edges, and the smell of warming iron and smoke layered over the raw scent of blood and dirt. He boiled water, washed his hands until they were raw, then cut the torn tunic sleeve away with his hunting knife to inspect the wound. It was a clean slice, maybe from a knife, maybe a rock, but deep enough to need stitching. He went to the small, battered tin kit that had been his companion since the war. Needle, thread, carbolic, a strip of cloth cut from a shirt that had once been his Sunday best. The kit had saved men and failed men. It had held his attention through nights of screaming and mornings of silence. He worked like a man in a memory muscles, remembering what the mind would have preferred to forget. He cleaned the dark blood, stitched the wound with 2 neat, practiced passes, tightened the knot, and wrapped it snug. She flinched once, a small, involuntary twitch, but didn't wake. When it was done, he stepped back and let out a long, slow breath that felt like he'd been holding it since Sarah's last day. She was alive. For now, he covered her with a thick wool blanket and placed a tin cup of water within her reach, set a second cup near the stove for warming broth. Then he dragged the only chair from the table and sat beside the bed, elbows on knees, hat turning over and over in his hands. Who was she? Who had done this? The trouble that followed her to his lonely cabin might not be done with her yet. The fire popped once, the stove ticking as it settled into its heat. Outside, Shadow pawed the ground and went still, as if he'd taken on the duty of guarding the door. He watched the small rise and fall of her chest the way one watches a far-off lantern on a winter road, counting the beats between hoping it doesn't blink out. Time went the way time does in rooms with stoves and burdens, slow, circular, indifferent. He changed the damp cloth at her temple twice. He cut a notch of jerky and softened it in hot water, then let it go to waste because the smell turned his stomach. Memory rose unwelcome, the field hospital where he'd stitched strangers by lantern, where he'd tried to bargain with God and discovered that God doesn't haggle. By the time the first pale, bruised light of morning bled through the window, the fire had burned low and his back ached from sleeping upright in the chair. A draft fingered the gap under the door. He rubbed at his eyes and looked at the bed. She was still there, blanket pulled to her chin, breathing steadier. He fed the fire, set coffee to boil, and stood close to the stove for the kind of warmth that reaches bone. Her fingers moved first, curling weakly under the blanket. Then her eyes opened. The wildness was still there, but it had a new edge: confusion, not panic. Wyatt froze where he was. Neither of them moved. She pushed herself up a little and grimaced when the bandage tugged at her shoulder. Her gaze skittered around the room, the iron stove, the shelves, the latch on the door, before finally settling on him. He made his voice low and steady, a deliberate calm that didn't come easy. "You're safe here," he said. "You were hurt. I fixed the wound." She looked down at her shoulder, at the stark white of the cloth against her skin, then back at him. She said something in her tongue, musical, in its cadence soft and broken at once. Then she switched to halting English, careful as a person testing ice on a river. "You, not, soldier?" Wyatt shook his head once. "No, not anymore." The tightness in her shoulders eased a fraction. He pulled the chair back to the table, increasing the distance between them on purpose. "Name's Wyatt," he said, tapping his chest. "Wyatt Stone." She hesitated, then touched her chest with her free hand, a small, fragile gesture. "Ilara, she said. The name sat between them like a small flame, strange and warm and carrying more story than they had time for. He nodded toward the tin cup of water. Drink. She reached for it with her good arm. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it to her lips. She drank as if water were an idea she'd dreamed about and only now discovered was real. When the cup emptied, she let it fall softly to the quilt. The room grew so quiet he could hear the tiny hiss of snow sliding down the stovepipe. Then her stomach answered for her low and ferocious, and Wyatt found himself smiling before he could stop it. Hungry, she admitted, shaping the word like it might break. He ladled beans from the pot he'd left at the back of the stove and set the tin plate on the table, then stepped away and let the space tell her she had a choice. She swung her legs off the bed and stood unsteady, proud. Her moccasins had been laid to dry near the stove. She was barefoot, and the boards must have felt hot after the frost outside. Up close, her wear showed the grit on her calves, the bruises at both knees, the careful way she protected her left shoulder. Someone had gripped her hard enough to leave stamps, shaped like fingers. Wyatt's jaw set in that old, stubborn way it had when orders used to come down that didn't make sense, but had to be followed anyway. She ate slowly at first, like an animal testing the edges of a trap, then faster, scraping the bottom of the plate with her spoon. He pretended not to watch. When she set the plate down, neat and deliberate, she studied him as if guessing the rules of a game she didn't care to play but couldn't afford to lose. He kept his voice even and his gaze steady. "You're welcome to stay until you're strong." Her brow furrowed over the word stay, and then unfurrowed, as if she'd decided to accept the plain meaning rather than search for tricks. She nodded once. He cleared the plate and the spoon, washed them without hurry. He let her see the way he moved through a room, no slamming of doors, no sloppy anger, no talk worse than silence. If a horse has been beat, you don't pet it quick. You stand near and breathe. When he stepped outside to check on Shadow, she drifted to the door and stood in the frame, wrapped in a spare flannel he'd left for her. The sleeves swallowed her arms to the elbows. Her legs were bare to mid-shin, and the morning light found their bruises and didn't turn away. She watched him all the way to the corral. Not with fear, exactly. With the sharp attention of a person deciding whether to trust. He felt the weight of it, not a burden, exactly, but a kind of summons. The kind a man doesn't get twice. He brought in more wood, fixed a loose hinge on the pantry door, and set to mending a strap at the table while she rested. 3 times he caught her eyes drifting to the small, dark length of leather she'd carried in with her, the strap she'd clutched in the pasture. She didn't hold it now. She just kept it near, like a charm a person hates but believes in. He thought of reaching across the small distance to take it, to toss it into the stove, and let fire do what fire does. But he didn't. Some things a person has to decide to burn for themselves. By late afternoon, the sky had thinned to hard glass, and the wind changed its pitch to something skittish and mean. Wyatt smelled the weather the way old horses do a foretelling he couldn't name in words. He banked the fire early, checked the barn latch, pulled the extra tarp over the hay, and rubbed Shadow down until the gelding's breath came easy and warm. Shadow nosed his coat pocket twice. Grain. There had to be grain, and Wyatt gave him a palmful. Inside, Alara sat at the corner of the bed, braid over her shoulder, elbows braced on her knees. She watched the door as if the door could tell her something. He poured coffee and let the smell fill the room like a plain, honest promise. "Storm's coming," he said. She gathered the flannel tighter across her chest. "You see it?" "I hear it," he said, "in the way things hold still." She tilted her head like she understood that sort of hearing. For a long while, the only sound was the stove's sigh and the small rasp of her breath. He set a tin cup at her knee and went to the shelf where the few books lived and the whittling scraps collected. Sarah's book still sat there, Wuthering Heights, spine frayed to threads like a dare he refused to take. He touched it once, then let his hand fall. "Not tonight." Alara spoke without turning her head. "You live here alone." "Since the fever." "Oh." She nodded like that fit some pattern. She already knew the pattern of absence, of rooms with 1 plate and 1 cup. She slid her eyes to the window, to the gray light thinning beyond the frost. "I had family," she said, the word thin as parchment. "Gone now." He didn't press. He'd learned in the war that details are for after a person is inside and fed, and even then, they're for later if ever. He set about making a thin stew, cutting what he had: a handful of beans, a slice of salt pork, the last of the carrots gone sweet near rot. She watched the knife in his hand the way a person watches a thunderhead alert, not flinching. He moved slow and sure, and kept the blade's promise pointed at the board, not the air. When he slid her a tin cup half full of broth, she wrapped her fingers around it and held it like a found fire. The first pellets hit the roof just after dusk, hard, fast, a song of sleet. The door shuddered under the push of wind, and Alara went rigid, eyes wide to the shadow of the latch. Wyatt set his cup down, stood, and put one hand flat on the doorboard. "It's just the storm," he said. "Nothing with a face." She drew a slow breath and let it out through her nose. He banked the fire heavy, raked coals across the bottom, and shoveled ash to hold the heat. He pulled the wool blanket extra high on the bed and laid a second on the pallet he'd spread near the stove. When he turned, she stood where she was, blanket around her shoulders, watching him as if those simple movements, blanket, bank, door latch, were a language she'd once known and forgotten. "You can sleep," he said, and nodded toward the pallet. She didn't move. Silence made the small room sound bigger and smaller at once. Wind rose from the ridge with the moan of a living thing and rattled the shutters. Alara swallowed, set her jaw, and took one step toward him. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, steel wrapped in cotton. "Cold," she said. Then, after the barest breath, "Close." Wyatt's heart behaved like a man who'd been told to carry more than his body allows, and did it anyway. He nodded once. No ceremony in the nod, no assumption, just the plain fact of cold and two bodies and a long night coming. He went to the bed, turned back the blanket, and Saturday she climbed in carefully and rolled onto her good side, back to the wall, leaving him the outside edge. He lay flat on his back and stared at the ceiling. The house spoke in tiny ticks and blunted thumps. The storm clawed and cooed. After a long while, she slid one hand for warmth, not want until her fingers found his shirt and rested there, open and light. He didn't move away. He woke at some dark hour to find the world pressed close and white sound deadened, heat settled low in the stove, the air tasting of iron and smoke. He checked the fire, added 2 splits, and went back to the bed. In the half-light, her face looked younger and older at once, sleep-smoothing lines that fear had cut. He wondered what name had been given to her when she was new, what roads had brought her to this door, and what price he'd pay for deciding to let her in. Then he wondered if the price had anything to do with it. Some doors you open because not opening them would make you someone else, and he didn't have the heart to be someone else again. Morning came thin and pewter. They rose stiff and quiet. He made coffee and eggs, what few he had left. She drank water like a worker's first pay, slow, disbelieving, grateful. He changed the bandage with hands that knew their business, and when the new cloth pulled against the healing edge, she bit her lip and didn't make a sound. "Good," he said. "It's clean." Alara lifted her gaze. "You say truth," she said, as if she'd weighed the words in the night and decided to test them. "I try to," he said. "It's cheaper that way." Her mouth softened in what might have been the beginning of a smile. She let the blanket slip to her elbows and took the flannel shirt he offered, shrugging into it with the set of someone not used to being given things that weren't going to be charged back later with interest. The sleeves were too long, the shoulders too wide, but the look of her in it made the room feel less like a tomb and more like a shelter with a door that opens both directions. The day set itself to chores like days do on a place that'll eat you if you let it. He chopped wood. She swept the strip of floor near the door with a bundle of dried willow twigs she found behind the stove. He hauled water from the half-frozen creek. She warmed a cloth and wiped the table clean, working her way from one corner to the other like a person mapping land they mean to keep. He patched a tear in the harness. She took a bone needle from a small pouch at her waist and stitched the torn hem of her tunic with a neatness that made him feel clumsy. By midday, the sky had burned off to a pale, brittle blue. He went to check the fence line where the wind had had its way with a rail. When he squatted to set it back, Ilara knelt beside him, no announcement. Just the fact of her there holding square-cut nails in her palm. He looked at her hand, small, scarred, steady, then took a nail and set it. "You don't have to," he said, meaning the work, meaning the staying, meaning more than he could afford to say. "I do," she said simply. The words landed like a stake in a claim. He hammered the rail home. The sound carried down the draw and came back as something like company. When they finished, they stood for a spell and looked out over the pasture, shadow a dark comma near the far fence, the creek a dull strip of pewter where ice hadn't sealed it yet. Ilara's braid had come loose at the end, and hair lifted and fell with the wind. Something in the sight of her, thin as hunger, stubborn as winter wheat, knocked at a door he'd nailed shut years back. Inside, the cabin smelled of beans simmering slow. She had thrown in a pinch of something from a deerskin pouch, a ground red that woke the nose and warmed the mouth after. He sat with his back to the wall and watched her pour. "Giles," she said carefully, tapping the pouch. "From a woman." The pause sat heavy, the space where a name might have gone. He nodded, the way a man nods when he's been handed a piece of someone's life and promises to carry it careful. They ate across from each other at the table. Ilara tested words like a blacksmith tests temper, quick, precise, pulling back if something didn't ring true. "Shadow," she said, and pointed at the corral. "Why this name?" Wyatt told her about the way the gelding had followed him home from an auction yard as a colt, silent and close, stepping where his shadow fell, as if he trusted the map of a man more than the ground itself. "Rails," she said, tapping the table's edge. He told her the word, said it again slower, waited while she shaped it. Each time she got it right, a small spark landed in the room, softer than a laugh, warmer than silence. In the afternoon he sat by the stove repairing a cracked stirrup. She came to stand beside him, near enough that he could feel the small rise of heat from her skin under the flannel. "This?" she asked, touching the leather lightly. He showed her how to anchor it, how to hold the buckle with the flat of the thumb so the tongue wouldn't burst through the hole. Their fingers brushed when he took it back. Neither of them moved away. A thin breath of winter traced the window's edge, and the ice laced across a lower pane like frost bloom. He felt the old ache in his side, and the newer ache in a part of himself he'd forgotten had anything to say. When the light dropped behind the ridge and the house shrank to the size of the fire's reach, he pulled the quilt up on the bed and set the pallet again. He didn't look at her when he did it, and she didn't look at him when she pointedly didn't lie down on it. The storm had left him raw and strange. Company had left him stranger. He banked the coals, tested the latch, and stood in the dim. He muttered to the empty air, an absurd habit picked up from passing through Dusty Creek and listening to the Barkers call out for attention in front of that new photo parlor. He shook his head at himself. Talking to air wasn't a sin yet, but it might be a warning. Ilara didn't smile, but her eyes held a question he couldn't answer without telling too much. He blew out the lamp and found the edge of the bed in the dark, the way a man finds a river by sound. She lay on her good side, back to the wall again, the small of her back, a bare, warm crescent beneath the flannel where the blanket had shifted. He lay straight and deliberate, and the space between them held like a line you tie off to keep a boat from drifting. The house breathed. The wind tested the eaves. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, a coyote drew a crooked thread of sound through the cold. "Men look for me," she whispered at last, voice low and steady in the dark. The words weren't a question, and they weren't quite a warning. They were the plainest truth in the room. "Maybe," he said, "but not here." Silence took the shape of that promise. She slid her hand again until her palm rested against his shirt, closer this time, not just for heat, but for the answer that lay under his ribs. After a while, she slept. He lay awake and let the dark do what it does, press a man's thoughts into coins and make him pay for each. The coin he paid was Sarah's last night, the way her breath had thinned, the way his hand had been useless against fever, the way the preacher had said God's will as if it were a stop he could request at the end of the line. He let that coin go. In its place, another Ilara on the pasture's frozen edge, the strap in her fist, the sound she hadn't made when the needle bit. He chose to keep that one. He woke before the light and moved quiet through the room. Coffee, fire, boots, coat. When he opened the door, the world had set itself to ice glass, and the kind of blue that makes a man honest if he looks straight at it. He broke the skin of ice on the water trough with a fence post and watched Shadow snort clouds and nose the water anyway. His breath lifted in the same shape and vanished as if he weren't there at all. For a second, he felt the edge of that old emptiness, a question about whether he existed outside the work his hands could prove. Then the door behind him creaked, and Alara stood in the frame, hair braided rough, flannel hanging off one shoulder, eyes narrowed against the bright. "Cold," she said, as if cold were a thing you could call by name and make it behave. "Cold," he agreed. She stepped outside barefoot before he could stop her, hissed at the shock, and then turned to retrieve her moccasins from the warmed stone by the stove. He held them out without thinking. Her fingers touched his, and the small place they met turned the morning into something less divided between sky and snow. They walked the corral rail together, he testing the give at each post, she watching the ground as if it might tell her a story if she stared long enough. When he reached the spot where the ground sloped toward the cut bank, he stopped because stopping there felt right. It was just a place. Dirt and grass and the scuffed mark his boots had made yesterday when he'd gathered her up. But places hold memory the way iron holds heat. He bent and touched the ground with 2 fingers and straightened again. Alara watched his hand, then the earth where it had been. She knelt careful, respectful, and laid her palm flat to the place where her body had given up and the world hadn't. "Not dead," she said, almost to herself. "Not dead," he echoed. They stood together in the cold a long minute more. Then he nudged her toward the door with a tilt of his head, and they went back to the small, stubborn business of living. He mended, she mended. He carried, she carried. He taught her rails and latch and kettle and kindling. She taught him cheel and stitch and the word she used for the deep quiet just before dawn, a word that tasted like river, rock, and ash, and meant more than quiet and less than peace. Toward sunset, clouds shouldered their way back over the ridge. He tightened the barn latch twice, then once more for luck, and rubbed Shadow's blaze with his sleeve. "You look after her if I can't," he told the horse, and felt stupid for saying it, and right. He went inside and found Alara sitting cross-legged near the fire, her braid half undone, patching the tear in her tunic with a scrap of thread he'd found in a tin. She glanced up at him once, then back down at her work, hands moving with a quiet, efficient rhythm. For the first time in 5 years, the cabin didn't feel like something that had happened to him. It felt like a thing he was doing. When the wind gave the shutters a good slap, she flinched and then stilled herself without help from him. He laid the harness on the table and checked each buckle, counting aloud because counting sometimes kept a man from thinking. 1, 2, 3. She looked up and said, careful but proud, 4. And when he smiled without meaning to, she looked at his mouth the way a person watches a door open in a wall that's been there so long, they forgot it used to be a gate. Night settled thick and slow. He banked the stove. She folded the repaired tunic and set it on the shelf, as if having a shelf was a luxury she intended to respect. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she stood a beat too long in the quiet, then crossed the space to sit beside him. They didn't touch. They shared the fact of the bed like a field between 2 fences that don't know they're meant to meet. "Safety," she said at last, as if testing the weight of the word. "Here, safety?" He tasted the hard shape of promise at the back of his throat. "Here," he said, "as long as I can make it so." She nodded. That was the only answer a person could give to a vow made by another person, that soft nod. Not belief exactly, but acceptance of the risk of believing. She lay down on her good side, and he lay on his, and the air between them felt like the width of a life, and also like nothing at all. Outside, the ridge wind changed direction, and the coyotes gave up on singing. Inside, the stove settled itself to a steady red eye and watched them through the night. Somewhere between the 2nd and the 3rd hour past midnight, a small sound pulled at his ear, her breath hitching, not from pain but from some dream rocking her off balance. He turned his palm toward her under the blanket, not touching, just close enough that heat could cross, and the hitch smoothed out the way a snag on a nail smooths when you fill it with something that fits. In the thin blue just before dawn, he slept like a man who has set down half a load and forgotten for a minute that he has to pick it up again. When light finally found the window, She was awake before him, looking at his face with the frank attention of a person reading weather. He kept still, letting the fact of being watched settle where the old emptiness used to live. "You stay," she said, not a question. He met her eyes. "You can stay," he said. The stove hummed its low, contented note. The day waited outside like a cold river waiting for a boot. He swung his feet to the floor and stood into the ache he'd earned. She rose after him, braid rough, flannel slipping off one shoulder. He turned to reach for the coffee pot and realized the cabin had accepted their bodies the way a good saddle accepts a rider without fuss, holding both weight and motion. The wind still had teeth, the ridge still had its knives, and the world was, as ever, both too much and not enough. But the room had changed shape around them, and the change felt like the first honest thing that had happened to him in a long time. They moved through the morning like a pair of hands learning to work the same tool. He cut kindling. She stacked it by length. He checked the cinch he'd repaired. She ran a finger over the stitch and nodded once, the way a craftsperson nods when a thing is true. He saddled Shadow to ride the east fence, and then unsaddled him, half smiling at himself. "Later," he said to the horse, "today we fix what's near." Near was the torn shelf, the loose hinge, the crack in the water bucket stave. Near was coffee and broth, and the way a person says a new word and tries it again. Near was the strap she'd brought in from the pasture and left, finally, on the table, instead of clasped in her fist. Near was choosing not to ask, and choosing to answer when asked. Near was the door latch, tested twice, and the quiet that came after, the kind of quiet that isn't emptiness at all, but room. Outside, the day hardened toward another weather. Inside, he felt the strange lift of being two where there had been one. A man could get used to that lift and call it something fancy. Wyatt called it work of the best kind. The kind where one person holds the nail and the other swings the hammer, and neither gets hurt because both have learned to move in step. The wind eased. The stove breathed. The sun pushed through a thin seam in the clouds and laid a pale stripe across the table, a crease of light that made even the nicks and scars in the wood look like part of a plan. He looked at Ilara and saw not what had been done to her, not the running, but a person standing in his house doing the plain work of living. He felt the line of his mouth soften without permission. "Stay," he said again, mostly to himself, and then louder. "Stay." She turned her head, met his eyes, and nodded once. No smile, no oath. Just the answer a person gives when the work ahead is hard and the road behind is worse. Outside, Shadow blew steam and stamped, the way a horse does when it has decided it belongs to a place. The ridge wind turned and lost its edge. The day, which had been waiting on their answer, slid forward into itself. And the cabin, no longer a tomb, not yet a home, became, for the first time in 5 years, a place where tomorrow might be invited in. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. That night, when he came in from the barn, she was sitting by the fire, her braid half undone, patching the tear in her tunic with a scrap of thread he'd found for her. She glanced up once at him, then back down at her work, her hands moving with a quiet, efficient rhythm. For the first time in 5 years, since finding her, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. It wasn't a home yet, not by a long shot, but it wasn't a tomb either. The next morning broke cold and colorless. Frost on the corral rails shone under the first, pale light. Wyatt woke to the sound of soft movement, not the fire, not Shadow outside, but Ilara shifting near the hearth. She had risen before him and was crouched low, feeding a split log to the fire with careful hand. Her braid had come loose overnight and hung in a rough line down her back, and his flannel shirt looked almost too big on her narrow shoulders. Wyatt sat up and watched for a moment before speaking. "You sleep?" She nodded once without looking back. "Warm," she said, her English slow but clearer than yesterday. He pulled on his boots and coat, poured the last of the coffee from the pot, and stepped outside into the brittle, biting air. Shadow greeted him with a soft snort, nosing for grain. Wyatt poured feed into the trough and kept his thoughts moving as steady as his hands. She was still here. She hadn't run in the night. That meant something. When he came back in, She had set his tin cup on the table and was standing with her arms crossed, watching him. The bandage on her shoulder needed changing. He gathered clean cloth, knelt beside her, and gestured for her to sit on the bed. She hesitated, but did as told. When he untied the old bandage and peeled it back, she bit down on her lip and didn't make a sound. The wound was clean. No sign of infection. "Good," he said, rewrapping it. "You'll heal." She gave him a short nod and said, "You live here alone?" The question surprised him. He wasn't used to anyone caring. Wife died 5 winters ago. His voice was flat, but steady. "No children. Just me and the horse." She studied his face like she was weighing the truth of it, then looked down. "I had family," she said the word, a careful, fragile thing. Gone now. Wyatt didn't press for more. It was enough to know she wasn't wandering for no reason. The day passed with small work. He mended a broken harness strap by the table while she sat nearby, watching with a stillness that wasn't quite restless. When he went outside to haul water, she followed, stepping barefoot into the frost before he handed her moccasins. She pulled them on quickly, a hint of embarrassment in her movements, then helped him carry the second bucket back to the cabin. Inside, she began putting things in order without asking, stacking tin plates, sweeping the dirt near the door with a bundle of twigs she found behind the stove. She moved quietly, but not like a servant, more like someone claiming a piece of the place for herself. Wyatt watched from the table. He didn't stop her. The cabin hadn't felt tended since Sarah. At midday, he saw her glance toward the creek, toward the place he had found her. Her hand closed slightly on the strap. She still carried the one she had been clutching when he picked her up. "You were tied?" he asked finally. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Camp, bad man." Her voice caught, but she forced the words out. "I run, they look." Wyatt's jaw tightened. That explained the bruises, the way she'd panicked when she first saw him. It also meant those men might still be close. "You're safe here," he said again. And he meant it, every single word. That night, after the chores were done, and Shadow had been seen to, Wyatt sat by the fire oiling his rifle, while Alara sat cross-legged near the hearth, mending the hem of her tunic with thread he'd given her. The firelight showed the curve of her shoulder where the bandage peeked through his shirt. The cabin felt different now, not crowded, not lonely, just full. When she was done with her sewing, she looked up at him, her face calm for the first time since he'd found her. "I stay?" she asked softly. Wyatt met her eyes. "For now," he said, though part of him already knew for now might turn into longer. The fire burned slow and steady, and for the first time in a long time, Wyatt didn't mind the thought of tomorrow coming. He woke in the dark to the faintest sound, a light scrape, like cloth against wood. Alara stirred, then went still, and he heard the snow-laden roof settle with a soft groan. He lay on his side, listening, counting his breaths. He wasn't a man for praying anymore, not since graves piled up too fast to carve names in the boards, but some old habit of hope, tight-fisted and mean, worked at the edge of his mind, asking that the storm hold off and that the men she feared had lost her trail. He closed his eyes and held the quiet the way he held the rifle, firm enough not to drop it, gentle enough not to break anything. The second morning she woke him, not with words, but with the smell of something sharp and warm rising from the stove. He sat up to see a small pot simmering. Beans, yes, but also something else. She lifted the lid and the sharpness curled through the room again. "Chilies?" he asked, surprised at the word in his mouth after years. She nodded, tapping the small pouch at her waist. "From before," she said. They ate in companionable silence. She pushed the bowl toward him again, insisting he take more, then raised an eyebrow when he tried to wave it off. He took it without a word. She smiled without showing teeth, an expression quick as a bird's flicker, and something in his chest unlatched, subtle and unarguable. The wind scraped at the eaves, but they went out anyway. Him to check the rails where the creek bent behind the cottonwoods, her to sweep the porch and bank snow up like a low wall, to cut the draft under the door. He pointed to the boards he meant to fix and handed her a tin of nails. She held them without flinching at the cold. "Rail," she repeated, shaping the word around her tongue. Rail, he agreed, and when she said it a second time, truer, he nodded. The language lesson was as unadorned as the work, a steady passing of names from his mouth to hers. Rail, post, trough, stanchion, snow, ice, blue, crow, hawk, cinnamon teal, though there were none of those last in winter. She gave him words back, not as trade, but as truth. Water, bend for the creek's elbow, skybone for the ridge's sharp spine, a word for fire that snapped quick at the end, like tinder catching. That afternoon they made a mortar of sorts, old coffee tin and a rounded stone, and she crushed a handful of juniper berries into powder. She'd found the branches when they hauled wood and asked with her eyes. He'd shrugged permission and watched her work. The scent lifted something bright into the cabin's dim air. With a damp scrap of linen, she dabbed a bit at the edge of her healing wound, a ritual of care so matter-of-fact it silenced him. The scar was knitting, the angry red easing into the brown of her skin, and he saw the steadiness returning to the set of her shoulder, to the lift of her chin. "Not soldier," she said that night, as if the thought had finally settled. "Not anymore," he answered. Her gaze held him, a measuring that wasn't a test. "But you stand." "I stand," he said. And they let the fire speak after that. On the third morning she woke him with a word he didn't recognize. She stood by the window, the blanket around her shoulders making a dark V of warmth against the blue-pale pane. "What?" he asked, pushing up on his palms, the old ache tugging his side. She pointed beyond the fence, where the creek narrowed under a spit of ice. "Fox. Sign," she said, and then in halting English, "Small one, quick. You say, tracks." He came to stand beside her. Tiny crescents stitched the snow, light and sure, cutting from the black-rimmed water to the scrub beyond the far rail. "Tracks," he said. "Yes." She traced the air with her finger, following the pattern on the ground as if she could hold the animal's path in the warm cabin with nothing but her hand. "Tracks," she repeated, and this time the word belonged to her mouth. They spent the day inside after the sky lowered and started spitting hard little grains of ice. Wyatt reseated the handle on his old spade, wrapped the haft tight with rawhide, then set the tool under the table to dry. Ilara, with a patience he could not recall seeing in anyone else, unbraided a short length of her hair, worked a narrow strip of softened hide through the strands, and wove tiny bone beads into the braid's end. It wasn't decoration. Not exactly. It was declaration, a reclaiming after the torn cloth and the leather strap in the running. She did not look at him as she tied the braid, but she did not turn away either. He pretended not to watch. He failed at pretending. Near dusk, the storm shouldered itself down from the ridge. The wind that preceded it had a kelp-cold note in its throat, the kind that stole breath and made horses roll their eyes white. Wyatt banked extra wood inside, lined kindling neat by the stove, checked the barn latch twice. Shadow was restless, ears swiveling to every clack and mutter, and when Wyatt laid a hand on the gelding's neck, he felt the steady hammer of the animal's heart under winter coat and thickened muscle. By dark, the sleet turned to a clattery rain of ice that broke and scattered across the roof like spilled nails. The door shuddered once in its jam, then set its jaw against the hinge. Ilara stood with a blanket around her shoulders, not quite near enough to the fire to be comfortable. "It's just the storm," he said. She nodded, but the line of her throat stayed taut. "Bad men come at night," she said, voice flat, not a tremble in it, just fact remembered by the body. "They won't come here," Wyatt answered. He didn't raise his voice to make it convincing. He let the plainness do the work. It struck him she might trust that more than any oath. When he folded the blanket down on his side of the bed, she didn't move toward the pallet he'd laid for her by habit the first night. She lifted her chin, stepped close enough for him to feel the cold in her hair, and said, "Close." Not plea, not order, just the word that meant warmth and breath and not being alone while the world tried its old tricks outside the door. He made room. She slid in careful, her healing shoulder turned toward the wall, her bare feet, a brief shock against his shin before she tucked them away. He lay on his back and felt the shift of the mattress as she settled, small adjustments drawn from some deep animal knowledge of how to share space without crowding. The storm shook out its temper, then its sorrow, then its last handful of ice. Between gusts, he could hear her breathing. He counted it like a man measures distance by paces. Steady, steady, steady. He woke once just before dawn to her hand, resting lightly against his ribs, not searching for anything, not asking. Just there. He did not move. Daylight came up bruised and thin. He rose, put coffee on, and opened the door to a world the color of pewter. Ice made lace of the cottonwood tips. The creek spoke in a hush. He brought in an armful of wood with his breath, making a small fog around his face, and found her sitting at the table, legs tucked under her, bone beads clicking soft against the back of the chair. She looked at his hands, red from the cold, and slid the tin cup toward him. "Drink," she said, the same even tone he'd used on her the first morning. The word made a small heat in him that coffee could not touch. He told her the names of the tools again while he set them in order on the table, awl, rasp, nippers, draw knife, and watched her say them back, precise as stitching. Then, on a small scrap of leather, he showed her how to cut with the grain instead of against it. She tried, caught the edge, looked up, and received his nod as if it meant something more than a good cut. Perhaps it did. By midday, the sky showed its blue bones through the gray. Wyatt set out to check for windfall and fence breaks. Ilara pulled on her repaired tunic and moccasins, belted the shirt tighter at her waist, and took up the second bucket without asking. They walked the pasture together, Shadow tracking them along the rail like a watchman. Where a post had heaved up just enough to wobble, Wyatt drove it back into the frozen earth, shoulders hard under his coat. Ilara steadied it with both hands, the muscles in her jaw jumping once when the mallet struck. When he was done, she blew out a breath and grinned quick and fierce. He didn't know he was going to laugh until he heard it in the air between them. "Strong," she said, patting the wood. "You or the post?" he asked, the corners of his eyes crinkling. She tilted her head, considering the question as if it were a real one. "Both." Late in the afternoon, a crow landed on the top rail, shook out sleet from its feathers, and complained at them. Ilara answered in a string of sounds that were not words he knew, clicks and low throaty syllables. The crow cocked its head, made a noise like a hinge in need of oil, and flapped away. Ilara looked pleased. He did not ask for a translation. Some things get to stay private. The world is big. Let it keep its pockets of mystery. They brought the last of the wood inside while the sun slid off the ridge and turned the snow the color of old peach flesh. Wyatt set a small iron pot on the back of the stove. Ilara stripped juniper needles with deft fingers, ground dried chilies in the tin mortar, and slipped both into the pot, as if apologizing to the beans for the long boil. The cabin filled with a warm, strange perfume. He could almost imagine the room had new walls. When they sat, he found her watching him with a frankness that, if he'd been younger, might have made him cocky. As it was, it just made him tired in a nicer way than usual. "You stand," she said again, as if testing the strength of the fact from a new angle. "I stand," he agreed, "and I'll keep standing." She nodded once. "Then I stay." The words set down between them like a plank bridging a creek. Something to step on, something to trust. There was no ceremony to it. No lightning-struck revelation, just a quiet realignment of the furniture of their lives. He felt it settle in his bones, one click after another, like a wheel hammered back onto an axle. After they ate, he cleaned the rifle by habit more than need. She watched his hands while he checked the firing pin and rubbed a thin sheen of oil on the bolt. He thought of Sarah without anger, only a soft, winter-tired gratitude then, of how many nights since he had kept the cabin lit against a loneliness that was a kind of weather. The air in the room now had a different shape. He didn't know how else to name it. He banked the fire. She curled against him under the blanket, her back warm along his side. In the dark, she said a small word that might have been a prayer. He didn't ask whose ears it was meant for. Morning brought sunlight, thin but honest. The world steamed in small breaths where the sun met the ice. Wyatt went to the barn, brushed Shadow until the gelding's coat shone like old chestnut in the light, then checked the shoe he'd reset 2 days prior. Ilara came to the door with a handful of crushed corn in her palm. Shadow's ears pricked. She laughed when his whiskered muzzle tickled the lines of her hand. and Wyatt felt a smile start in him that didn't go away even after it should have. They worked opposite ends of the same tasks that day, and the day after him with the heavy things, her with the small fixes no one had done since Sarah. The place took the changes the way snow takes a print, first shallow, then deep. In the evenings, when the wind shouldered against the shutters, they traded stories, broken and bent as their shared words. Wyatt spoke of a fence he and his neighbor had stretched across a gully in a single long day before the sickness, how the two of them had argued over the angle of the corner post, then set it the way Sarah had suggested, and found her measure sound. Ilara listened with the kind of attention that makes a man feel he is worth the breath he spends. In return, she told him pieces. A summer camp near a river with stones so smooth they felt oiled, a sister who could run the ridge like a deer, a mother's hand warm at the back of her neck. The names were mostly gone from the telling, taken by loss and the rough road, but the shapes remained. He did not try to fit them to places on a map. He held them like he held the memory of the morning. Sarah laughed so hard at his crooked biscuits she cried. The first storm rolled in 3 nights later, announced by a wind that whistled down from the ridge and shook the cabin door on its hinges. Wyatt had seen the clouds coming since noon, low and heavy, so he had stacked extra wood inside and checked the barn latch twice. Shadow was restless, stomping in his stall, ears twitching at every gust. By the time darkness fell, sleet was hammering the roof, a hard, relentless sound that drowned out everything else. Wyatt sat by the stove, tightening the last buckle on the harness he had repaired. Ilara was near the hearth, her knees drawn up, the repaired hem of her tunic resting just above them. The fire threw a soft glow across her face. When the wind gave a loud slam against the shutters, she flinched and turned quickly toward the sound. "It's just the storm," he said. Her eyes stayed on the door a long moment. "Bad men come at night," she said quietly, her voice uneven. "They won't come here," Wyatt said, and he meant it. "Not while I'm standing." Something in his tone must have landed because she let out a slow breath and nodded. But when he rose to bank the fire for the night, she didn't go to the pallet he laid by the hearth. Instead, she stood where she was, blanket around her shoulders, watching him. "You can sleep," he said, gesturing to the floor. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Cold," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. Then after a pause, "Close." Wyatt froze for a beat. The meaning was clear. She was asking to share his bed, not out of anything but need. He waited. The cabin was cold. The storm would not let up before morning, and she was still healing. "All right," he said finally, his voice even. He moved to the bed, pulled back the blanket, and sat on the edge. She climbed in carefully, lying on her good side with her back to the wall. The space between them was small. Wyatt lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm tear past outside. After a long while, she shifted and her hand brushed against his shirt. Not searching, just resting there. Her breathing slowed. Wyatt didn't move away. For the first time since Sarah's death, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. The storm roared on until near dawn, but neither of them woke again until the light came gray through the window. When Wyatt opened his eyes, she was already awake, looking at him. She didn't flinch. "You stay here," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet statement, as though confirming to herself that this place, this man, this cabin were not just a passing stop. Wyatt held her gaze. "You can stay," he said. That morning she helped him bring in water, her shoulders stiff but holding. She moved more freely now, less like a stranger, more like someone who belonged. By mid-morning the storm had blown clear, and the sky was a pale winter blue. Wyatt stood on the porch watching Shadowpaw at the corral snow, and felt the air change inside him. She wasn't just surviving now, she was staying. They ate late that night, soup thinned with water and thickened with cornmeal, and afterward she showed him how to twist a cord from rabbit hide and hair, a strong line fine as a string. "Good for snare," she said. "Not for hunter, just for hungry." He heard the difference. Before sleep took them, she sat up on her elbow and said carefully, "You have ghosts." It wasn't accusation, it wasn't pity. "Yes," he said. "I know their footprints by now." She nodded. "They do not come in when door is shut. She tapped his chest once, a small knock on a stubborn door. He didn't answer, but he heard her. On the fourth morning since the storm, the world wore sunlight like a thin shawl. They took advantage of it. Wyatt cut deadfall back from the fence. Ilara dragged branches by the smaller end with a half-laughing stubbornness that made her braids swing and the beads chime against the bone. When she flagged, he took both ends and finished the drag without trying to make it look easy. She noticed and didn't argue. Near noon, he found a set of tracks at the far edge of the west pasture where the snow thinned under pinyon and scrub. Not fox this time. A single horse, unshod behind, shod in front, cutting a line from the creek bend toward the lower trail. Wyatt crouched, knuckles braced in the snow, and felt the old life touch his spine. He leaned to the print and saw the ice rim clean at the edges. "Not old," he said. "An hour, maybe less." Ilara's breath puffed beside him. She looked the way Shadow did when a cougar's shadow slid across a ridge, not panic sharpness. He stood, eyes traveling the line of prints until they slipped past the brush and were gone where the trail cut down. The world held its breath the way it does before a shot. He straightened. "We work," he said, and the words did not ask anything except the one thing they always asked. "Keep going." They did. But that evening he kept the rifle closer to hand, and she rolled her bedding a little nearer the door, as if she could meet a danger by getting to it sooner. Neither of them said the thing out loud. It lay on the table with the tin plates and the knife and the small pouch of chilies, waiting. The wind rose again, but this time without storm in it. It rattled the dry leaves trapped in the fence line and made the barn's loose eave knock. Ilara braided her hair tighter. Wyatt checked the barn latch a third time. When he came in, her eyes tracked the rifle, and then his face, and something like trust, thin as first ice, but stronger than it looked, settled into place between them. He banked the fire late. She set the cup where his hand would find it, and the night put its old coat on. He lay down with his arm under his head and listened, counting the horse's snorts, the stove's small ticks, the slipping hush of the creek. He had a feeling the world would come knocking soon enough. He also had a feeling that when it did, there would be 2 sets of boots beside the door, not one. Outside, the ridge breathed cold. Inside, the cabin took their warmth and gave it back. He closed his eyes and let that be enough for now. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The storm had crusted the world in glass, and every step across the yard made a sound like breaking dishes. Wyatt rose before the light and found Ilara already awake, legs tucked underneath her on the edge of the bed, hair roughly braided, mending a tear near the hem of her tunic with the bone needle from her pouch. She looked up at him briefly, no startle now, just a small acknowledgement, then back to her sewing as if it were the most natural thing on earth to be in his cabin at daybreak. That plain sight hit him with a quiet, disorienting warmth. A person at his table again, doing the small work that keeps a life from falling apart. He brewed coffee, and they shared the first cup in a silence that wasn't brittle anymore. When he stepped outside, she stepped with him, tightening his flannel at the throat and squinting against the blue-white glare. The air had that high, clean taste that comes after a front pushes through and takes yesterday with it. They set to the fence, moving in a rhythm that had appeared without negotiation. He lifted rails and shouldered posts into true. She held the nails ready against his palm, steady as a little anvil. She was careful with the bad shoulder, guarding it the way a wolf guards a fresh wound with caution, not fear, and he matched her pace like a team horse matches the other's pull. When he leaned to pin a rail, she leaned beside him and braced it with both hands. When he stood to swing the hammer, she let the head rest briefly in her palm, feeling the weight as if trying to understand the language of iron. "You don't have to," he said once, meaning the work, and more than the work. "I do," she answered, and there was no challenge in it. Only the simplicity of a decision a person has already made. They talked little because they didn't need to. Words rose when they had a job to do. She asked the name for things and made him say them twice. He asked about the herb in her pouch and learned to call it by the word she used, chipotle, letting the syllables sit in his mouth until they felt like they belonged there. When she said rails and the AI sounded like river water, he smiled. When he said Chile and the chi came out too sharp, she laughed softly, covering her mouth as if laughter were a thing that might escape and not come back if it got too bold. Inside, beans simmered with the red powder she'd taught him to pinch, and the air in the cabin shifted. It still smelled like wood smoke and iron, but now there was something warm and unfamiliar braided through it. He realized that he'd been hungry for longer than he could remember, hungry for food he didn't make the same way every day, hungry for the sound of another person's work, hungry for the small give and take of shared space. Need has a way of disguising itself as preference. A man can get used to a hollow until he calls it home. After they ate, he set the cracked stirrup on his knee and worked a new thong through the slit. Ilara drifted over and touched the leather, as if asking permission without the trouble of making it a question. He showed her the way to hold the buckle's tongue with the meat of the thumb so it wouldn't tear the hole. Their fingers met and held for the space of a heartbeat. Neither pulled away. Outside, the ice gave up a slow sigh as the sun found it. In the afternoon, the quiet took on the shape of trust. She swept the floor with a bundle of willow twigs until the planks looked like they had been tended by someone who intended to keep them. He brought in wood, and she stacked it by length, not because he'd asked, but because order was a gift she could give. He set a broken hinge on the table. She took a sliver of sinew from her pouch and stitched the tunic hem with a tight, even hand that made his own repairs seem clumsy. When she finished, she tied off the thread with her teeth, looked at the mended edge as if blessing her own work, then slid the needle back into the pouch with the small, satisfied nod of a craftsperson. The nod reached something in him that had been poorly fed. It felt like the way a fence corner looks when the last staple goes in and the wire hums true. By mid-afternoon, Shadow wandered the far side of the yard, snooping for oats. The gelding had begun to loiter where Ilara stood, angling his head so she'd scratch the solid place just before his ear. When she did it, he melted like tallow at the edge of a flame. Wyatt watched the horse teach the woman, and the woman teach the horse, and he felt the world settle around them, not hard and tight the way a trap closes, but snug the way a blanket wraps a rightness that did not ask permission, only recognition. When the light thinned, they came back inside. She tested new words over the evening tasks. Sky. She pointed to the stubborn blue still holding over the ridge. Sky, he echoed, then added, cloud, as a gray sheet dragged itself across the stallion blue, and haze and horizon, because the good words arrive in small families. She repeated each, patient, trying the sound against the shape of her mouth. When she tried home, she did not look at him, and he did not look at her. They let the word hover between them like a bee in a green spring day, too precious to swat, too dangerous to catch. Later, she came to stand beside him where he sat by the stove. This, she asked, touching the stirrup. This holds the weight that keeps you in the saddle, he said. She nodded as if she already knew it, then tested the leather again, pressing down with the heel of her hand until the thong sang lightly. She said nothing more, but her body had shifted closer, enough that he felt the aliveness of her a warmth with edges, like a small fire that had learned its boundaries. When night came on, he banked the coals and spread his old pallet by the hearth out of habit. She didn't move toward it. He pretended not to see her, pretending not to see it. She went to the bed and lay on her good side, leaving him the outside edge and the width of a promise in between. He joined her. In the dark, her voice was a thin thread. Men look for me still. He breathed once through his nose, slow and even, letting the old soldier in him stand up and look around the room. He had stopped calling himself a soldier years ago, but some habits don't retire. The door's latch, the stove's iron that could be a weapon, the window latch, the rifle within reach, Shadow's warning snort as an early bell if hooves approached over ice. Maybe, he said, truth plain. But not here. She nodded against the pillow. After a moment, her hand found his chest and rested there lightly, like a small bird testing a branch. He kept his breath steady, and the bird did not startle. He lay awake while she slept and thought through the problem of strangers. It wasn't only that the men would come. It was the shape of who they would be, patient enough to comb the valley, greedy enough to make a mistake. Troublemakers like that love the smell of their own courage and often confuse it with wisdom. He'd known their like at borders and river crossings and auction yards. He did not intend to be charity for their story. The next day, he set about turning the cabin into a place with plans. He cut 4 lengths of leather thin, springy, then punched holes in each and hung them on pegs near the door. "Why?" she asked. "Laces," he said. "For boots, for saddles, for bundles, for leaving fast if we have to." She nodded. He brought in a length of sapling and shaped the ends with his draw knife, making 2 crude snowshoes by noon. He wove them with rawhide and set them by the door. "If the snow goes deep, these keep you from sinking," he said. "You move slower, but you move." She ran her fingers along the webbing and then set the shoes where he'd set them, as if moving things made in urgency a second time would invite the future into the room before it was welcome. He set up a line of tin cans on the corral rails and took the rifle down from the hooks. "You know this?" he asked, not putting the weapon in her hands yet, only letting it be near. She nodded once and looked away. That told him enough. Not a stranger to violence, but not coveting it either. "Later," he said, "when your shoulder is ready." She exhaled, and the breath held a piece of something that was not quite relief, not quite regret. They built small practices into the day without announcing them. He whistled a 2-note call before he came through the door so she could hear it was him. She tapped twice on the table when she moved from the bed to the hearth so he could find her without looking. He taught her the fast way to coil a rope with the loop at the ready. She showed him how to twist a strip of bark into a cord that would hold a kettle steady over coals. In the afternoons they carried snow inside by the bucket and let it melt into the water barrel. And when the barrel was 3/4, he marked the stave with a notch so they would not be surprised by thirst if the creek froze solid. The weather eased for 3 days, and in that mercy, a life took root. He saddled Shadow and rode the east ridge long enough to check sign. He saw coyote, rabbit, deer, and once a print that set his heart up in his throat, a U-shaped scar where a shod hoof had come down hard. Not fresh, not old enough to be unimportant. He studied it until the wind erased the edges, and then rode on like a man trying to look uninteresting. Back at the cabin, Ilara had taken a square of old flour sack and stitched 4 pockets into it with her bone needle. Into each, she tucked the little things a person needs when the world goes sideways. 3 needles, a pebble of lye soap, a pinch of the red chila, a strip of tinder cloth. She rolled the square into a bundle and set it on the shelf, next to a small packet he recognized only when she drew it open. Black seeds, slick and bright. "Beans?" he asked. "Corn," she said, touch reverent. "From before." He didn't ask before what. She closed the bundle and laid her palm on it for a second, and he understood that sometimes a prayer looks like inventory. That night, when the wind bullied the corners again, she flinched and stood straighter through the flinch. He set his rifle on the table and took it apart, piece by piece, cleaning and oiling as if the future depended on the dull shine of a bolt. She watched from the hearth. At length she rose and approached the table carrying the short strap she had brought in from the pasture. She set it down in front of him with a tiny firmness, as if the motion itself had to be finished without second-guessing, or the strap would become stronger than she was. "No need now," she said. "Not a question. A verdict." He took the leather in his hands and turned it once. It was not evil. It was just a thing that had been used to do a job no thing was ever meant to do. He opened the stove door, laid the strap on the coals, and watched it buckle and blacken and become smoke. For a moment, she stood as if some part of her would be burned with it. When nothing in her burned, she sat, quieter than before but not smaller. The next morning, he taught her to shoot. He waited until the air lifted above ugly cold. He checked her shoulder, watched how she raised her arm and lowered it, saw the wince, and how she worked through it. "Short," he said, and brought the smaller carbine down the one he had used to shoot coyotes off the chicken run years ago, back when the house had voices and a future he could name. He showed her how to seat the buttstock in the meat of the shoulder and not on the bone. He showed her the way to let her cheek find the stock, not like laying a head down to sleep but like listening for something faint. He set the muzzle down range, never across her knee, never toward the cabin. He showed her the safety by habit and the trigger by reverence. She listened the way a good horse listens, ear canted, whole body balanced for what comes next. When he set the first cartridge, she breathed in and breathed out, and the breath became a choice instead of a reflex. She lifted, sighted, fired. The shot popped clean in the air, and the tin can jumped clean off the rail. She did not smile. He did, a little, for both of them. Again. He stopped her after 5. Not because she was reckless, but because she wasn't. He did not want to see the carbine and her hurt shoulder fight, and one of them lose. He cleaned the barrel while she set the cans upright for tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. People like them had to apprentice themselves to readiness, as if it were a trade. That afternoon, they sat at the table and made a list neither of them could read. He drew pictures with a bit of charcoal on a scrap of sack, a coil of rope, a water skin, a knife, a blanket, a packet of corn, a small bag marked with 3 dots for things we will think of when we can think. She nodded solemnly when he pointed to each. When he tapped the 3 dots, she reached and added a 4th dot with her fingertip, smiling for the first time in a way that showed a flash of teeth. "Always there is one more thing," she said. He laughed, a low sound that startled him. It had been a long time since his chest had done that particular work. The stove hummed its steady note. Outside, Shadow pawed and snorted, and then fell to contented silence. The cabin held them like a hand holds 2 coins, the warmth of their weight making the metal sweeter. That evening, a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the direction of the coulee beyond the north ridge. Wyatt saw it while chopping, half turned to listen to the hollow of his own yard. It was too straight for brush fire, too steady for lightning struck. This was a deliberate cookfire, banked and trained by hands that knew how to set a camp low and quiet. He stared until his eyes stung, and then set the axe down and wiped his palms on his coat, suddenly aware of how human a thing it is to have sweat run cold when the air is killing cold. "Ilara," he called, not loudly, not to alarm her, just to hear how the name comported itself in his mouth when trouble was nearer than theory. She came to the doorway with her hair braided tight against the wind and her eyes already asking the question. He jerked his chin toward the smoke. She narrowed her eyes, measured the direction, then looked back to him and made a small motion with her hand that meant, plain enough, not today, but soon. He nodded. He did not say how men sleep when they intend to wake mean. He did not say how a small fire can eat a dark if you starve the air around it just right. He did not say, we can run and be hunted every day, or we can stand and be hunted one day. He said, we have stew because people fight better on food than on fear, and he intended to win in the ways that count before he had to win with bullets. They ate at the table like ordinary people. He told her about Dusty Creek, how the storekeeper watered the molasses in winter to make it pour and called it an accident, how a boy he'd known helped shoe horses with a coffee can of nails that had been used 3 times and bent straight again by patience. She told him, with the few English words she owned and the expanse of her hands, about a red canyon where water braided itself over flat dark rock and children slid down the polished stone on their backs in summer, the sun turning hair blue where it dried memories shaped like flint, sharp enough to cut, useful enough to keep. When the stew was gone, he rose and went to the small box on the shelf, where he kept his blacksmith odds, the broken nails he saved, because he hated to throw away a shape that might become another shape if you gave it heat and attention. He set the little portable forge on the hearth, just a low brick frame, and his hand bellows, and worked a horseshoe nail into a ring with a head as delicate as he could make it. The work slowed his breathing. The sound of the bellows was the sound a man makes when he has remembered a thing that made him decent and brings it back into circulation. He set the cool ring on the table and did not say what it was for. He was not asking any question that night. Asking can be a kind of pressure, when pressure is the last thing a person needs. Ilara picked up the ring and turned it between thumb and forefinger, the way she had turned the strap the day before. Then she set it on the table in the space between them, where stew bowls had been, and looked at him without blinking. The look was not promise or refusal. It was the look people use when they choose to live in a question together. He slept with the rifle within reach. Near midnight, Shadow's hooves beat once against the stall board, then went quiet the way hooves do when a horse remembers it doesn't want to call attention. Wyatt sat up, heartbeat already doing the old drill. He slid from the bed without jarring it. Ilara's eyes were open in the dark before his feet found the floor. She did not speak. He pressed 2 fingers to his lips, then pointed to the floor by the bed. She rolled and reached, and came up with the small knife he'd given her, blade against her wrist, body close to the wall, out of the line of the window, out of the line of the door. He wanted to tell her she was doing everything right. He had not taught her those things. Life had. He crossed to the shutter and lifted it barely. The yard lay in the blue hush between cloud and snow. The smoke beyond the north ridge had thinned to a smear against the dark. No movement. The house made one small pop as a knot in the wood gave itself up to the heat. He closed the shutter, slid the bar into place, and felt, not foolish, but aware that a person who stays alive learns how to confirm fear with facts before he lets it set terms. They slept again, but not all the way. He dreamed, if it could be called a dream, of a river crossing where the water was so cold it ate the feeling from a man's feet and left him with nothing but intention. He woke before dawn with the taste of that river in his mouth, and the taste felt like stubbornness and something akin to relief. In the gray, they moved through the same small rites: coffee, wood, water, a check of the latches. The ribbon of smoke was gone by full morning, blown down into the folds, or fanned to nothing. He could tell himself it had been a trapper or a hunter taking the long way toward the rail line. He could, but he did not. Men who take where there are people to take from. He saddled Shadow and rode a slow circle no wider than a mile. Twice he found sign he did not like: a cut branch bent to point the way a man had gone, and a cigarette end tamped into the snow where someone had crouched and waited. The tobacco was cheap and mean. He broke the stub and let it fall, fighting the useless wish that cigarettes left tracks like boots. At the cut bank, he dismounted and pulled his glove off with his teeth. He pressed the back of his hand to the earth where he had found her. The ground was hard as iron again, hidden heat gone to the deep. He looked toward the fold where the creek dropped out of sight, and then to the line of cottonwoods that took storms first and came up green anyway every spring by a logic older than fences. On the way back, he scanned the ridge for a flick of sun off metal. Nothing. Stillness can be kindness or it can be cunning, and the ridge had not yet decided which it would be to them. When he returned, Ilara had moved the ring. It sat on the windowsill now, where thin light touched it, brightening the iron as if it were something finer. Not a statement, just a placement. A person puts a thing where they can see it if they are thinking about it. He would not take the seeing away from her by speaking his hope aloud. Hope is iron too. Put it in the fire too soon and it warps. He worked the day carefully, hands busy, mind slow. She moved through the room as if measuring it and learning the floor's memory. The boards had a low spot near the hearth and a high spot by the bed where a new plank had once gone in. She found both without being told, and he took it as another sign, small but sound, that the cabin was absorbing her into its map. When the sun dropped, they ate, they banked the stove, and they lay down without ceremony. "Close," she said, and smiled now, no shame, no apology, just the plain naming of a physics that heat understands. He turned toward her and put one hand on the curve of her waist through the flannel. Her breathing steadied. The wildness in her eyes had not left. It had changed its job. Where it had once been lookout, now it was witness. Sometime in the blue hours, wind woke the house with a low hoot. He listened without worry and drifted back. Dawn came clean as a new coin. 3 days passed like that. On the 4th morning, Shadow gave a warning snort, a specific sound he didn't waste on deer, and stamped hard enough to shake powder off the rail. Wyatt stepped to the porch, rifle leaning like an old friend against the doorframe, the familiar weight of it more comfort than threat. A single rider was coming up the trail, coat collar turned up, hat brim low, moving in that measured way that says a man is not in a hurry because he thinks the world island. Ilara looked up from near the hearth, saw his face, and stilled. Without a word, he tipped his head toward the alcove behind the bed. She went there quickly, no panic, no chatter, and crouched, pulling the extra blanket over her shoulders the way a person pulls the sky over themselves when they intend not to be seen. The rider reined in at the yard's edge. "Afternoon," he called, casual as a man borrowing a match. Wyatt didn't answer at first. He walked down into the yard and made a place of himself there, boots planted, hat brim low, shoulders squared in that old polite stance that means, "This is far enough." "What do you want?" he said, a voice that didn't step aside. "Looking for someone," the man said. "Young woman, about yay high, ran from a camp a couple days back. Scar on the shoulder. Dress might be torn." Wyatt didn't move. He did not waste the small hope men like that always hope for, that someone will accuse them of something so they can perform injury. He said only, flat as fence wire, "A lot of ground out here." The rider smirked and glanced toward the cabin door, the way a fox glances at a hen house hinge. "Pays good if you find her." He let the words sit there like bait. Wyatt shifted his weight just enough to bring his body between the door and the man's eyes. "You're not looking here," he said, calm and final. Something in the tone must have made the man weigh his odds. He spat into the snow, tugged the reins, and turned. "Fine," he threw over his shoulder. "She's trouble. You'd best hope you don't find her." The hooves faded into the hard quiet. Wyatt stood until the sound was gone, to make sure not to look hard. When he turned, Elara was already standing, breathing quick and silent, eyes on his mouth, as if the shape of the next thing he said would set the room. "They won't take you," he said. He heard the weight of the promise pass through him like a beam cut to length and hoisted into place. Promises like that settle slow. If they fall, they break more than what they were meant to hold. She crossed the room, stopped just close enough that he could see her hands shake, then pressed her face against his chest. His arms came up without advice from his brain and held her there, not to hide, not to hush, only to let her hear the truth of his heartbeat. A heartbeat can tell a person what language cannot. That night he cleaned the rifle like a man polishing a headstone, gentle, steady, with respect for what the iron had already done and what it might be asked to do. Elara sat by the fire and watched the long process, patience like a light around her. When he set the rifle aside, she came and placed the strap ghost on the table. Not a strap now, not a ghost, nothing at all but ash in the stove. "No need," she said, and he opened the door and gave the last of it to the red. "Stay," she said next, and the word had moved since last time. It no longer stood on unsure legs. It planted its feet. He looked at her until the word did not feel like a cliff anymore and said back, "Stay." It felt, in his mouth, less like a decision and more like a naming, a thing that had already happened, spoken aloud so that the room could rearrange itself accordingly. They slept close, not for fear, not for weather, for choosing. Winter closed both fists after that. And each morning began with the clean, animal work of breaking ice and ended with the uncertain ceremony of letting the banked coals glow like a single watchful eye. Elara moved through the tasks with the quiet authority of someone who has rebuilt a life from smaller supplies. She learned the hitch on the barn latch that kept it from lifting when the wind came from the north. He learned the word she used for the shallow bend in the creek where the ice thickens first. The word meant more than ice and less than danger. They made soup of whatever the shelf offered, and each time she bent to lift the kettle from the hook, he saw the red seam of new scar along the curve of her shoulder and felt, with surprise, not the old anger but a new steadiness, like watching a field you've planted through the first hard frost and discovering the shoots survive. On the last night before trouble returned for certain, Wyatt sat with the small ring on the windowsill and found himself polishing it with the pad of his thumb. He left it there. He would not hurry iron into a job before it wanted the work. Before dawn, Shadow's ears cut forward, and his head came up. He snorted once, loud, the way a right horse does, when the world at the fence line is no longer theory. Wyatt was already buckling his belt. Elara was already binding her braid, the little knife at her hip, the carbine set where her hand could find it without announcing itself against the wall. They did not speak. They did not ask one another the question each knew the answer to. When they stepped onto the porch, the air was so clear it pinged in the nose. 2 riders. The first, a man Wyatt had already measured and found greedy. The second, bigger, jaw ridged with a scar that spoke of long decisions made quickly. The horses came in at a trot that said the men meant to be brave and hoped bravery would be cheap today. Wyatt stood down off the steps, rifle cradled but not lifted yet, boots planted. Ilara stood just behind his shoulder, not hiding, not daring, present as a fact. "We asked around," the first man called. "She's worth more than we thought. Couple of us are headed north to collect. Thought we'd check here one more time." Wyatt said nothing that a court would need to remember. He let his silence say the old thing. "You are at the end of this trail. You seen her?" the man pressed. Wyatt looked at him as if the question were new and disappointing. "I've seen nobody." The second man leaned, grinned, tilted his head toward the porch where Ilara's shadow lay long. "Mind if we take a look around just to be sure?" Wyatt stepped one pace forward. He did not raise his voice, because he did not need the help. "You set foot in my yard. You'll be sorry for it." Then, the scarred one's grin went thin. The first man spit and moved his hand on the rein like a gambler handling a coin. A hard stillness came down that had nothing to do with weather. Somewhere behind them, Shadow blew and stepped once, as if to remind the day that a big animal could make a large choice quickly. "Mount up," Wyatt said quietly. "Ride." They turned, because sometimes men choose to live long enough to make a different mistake another day. The horses' hocks bunched, the snow bit under iron, and the two of them became smaller and then small, and then gone over the shoulder of the ridge. Wyatt watched the emptiness where they had been until it felt full again, not with fear, but with a plan. He lowered the rifle and exhaled like a man finishing the first mile of a hard run, knowing the race isn't over. Behind him, Ilara's hand found the back of his coat, low and pressed. The press said what words would have bruised. Inside, they did what people do after decision. Boiled water, cut bread, checked the latches they had already checked. The ring caught a slice of light on the sill, and Ilara paused to look at it. She did not put it on. She did not move it. She lifted her eyes to his face and held them there. Whatever came next, cold, men, distance, the long arithmetic of 2 lives learning the same sum, they would not be doing it alone. The day had that shape now. Not a straight line, not a circle. A road that split, and then found itself again a mile later because 2 people had learned to walk close enough to share the same track. They ate, they worked, they waited without wasting themselves on jitters. By afternoon, the sky was a pale coin, and the ridge held its breath. Ilara fed shadow oats from her palm. He bumped her shoulder with his soft, whiskered mouth, and made a low sound in his throat that Wyatt had only ever heard him make before in early spring, when the first good grass shows under last year's dead. Toward dusk, Wyatt went to the stove and opened the small brick forge again. He pumped the bellows twice and then didn't feed the fire. Instead, he simply sat on the hearth with the bellows in his hand, like a man holding onto a tool because he isn't sure what else to hold. Ilara crossed the room, knelt, and took the bellows from him. She set it down, turned his hand over, and put her palm against his. The touch made a circuit that was not electricity and not heat, but something old as either a loop that closed and then stayed closed because both ends agreed. He slept with his boots near and the rifle closer. At first light, hooves came again, not at a trot this time, but at a purposeful walk that said the cost had been counted and the bill had been brought to the table. Wyatt rose. Ilara rose. He looked at her and she at him. There was a steadiness in her face that had not been there when he found her by the cut bank. Her eyes were still wild, but the wildness was no longer flight. It was a country. They stepped onto the porch together, the morning brittle and bright, the breath of the horses blowing plumes that caught the angle of the sun and turned white to gold for a heartbeat before it vanished. The men pulled up in the yard, and the one with the scar laid a shotgun across his thigh like a priest laying down a book. "You don't want this fight," the first man said. Wyatt leveled the rifle without raising his voice. "You're not taking her." The yard went still. Even the ice stopped its slow complaints. At Wyatt's shoulder, Ilara set her feet and slid one hand down the carbine stock, the way a person's hand finds the back of a chair they mean to lift. In that small, precise second before the day declared itself, Everything that had been done, every stitch, every nail, every bowl of stew, every word taught and learned stood up behind them like a wall that was also a home. The next moment belonged to the riders. The one with the scar spat and swung a leg as if to dismount. Shadow stepped forward from the corral, ears flat, head low, a large, gentle thing, remembering he was also powerful. Wyatt did not blink. The scarred man hesitated. The first man's mouth tightened. The sun cleared the ridge and found the ring on the windowsill and sent a clean line of light across the yard, a bright seam between two kinds of day. "Not worth it," the first man muttered at last and jerked his reins. They turned. The ridge took them. The snow ate the sound. The yard opened its lungs and breathed. Wyatt kept the rifle up until the last horse dropped out of sight. Only then did he lower it, the way a man lowers a weight slowly, because he respects it. Ilara stood beside him, not touching now, not needing to. Inside, the cabin waited stove-banked, wood-stacked, ring-bright, water barrel 3/4.